When the world was burning, when cities crumbled under the weight of bombs and millions marched toward death camps, there was a force moving silently beneath the chaos. Not tanks, not armies, money, American money, flowing across the Atlantic like a dark river, feeding the very machine designed to destroy democracy itself. And at the center of this financial web stood one name: Chase Bank. The same institution that promised prosperity to American families was simultaneously bankrolling the Third Reich. How does a bank become complicit in genocide? How do ledgers and transactions translate into human suffering? You are on War Profits, where we uncover the darkest and most profitable stories of World War II corporations. This is the story of how American capitalism shook hands with fascism and why the trail of money leads to places we'd rather forget. Picture this: New York City, 1938. The Chase National Bank towers over Manhattan, a cathedral of American capitalism, its marble halls echoing with the footsteps of the wealthy and powerful. Outside, newsboys shout headlines about Hitler's annexation of Austria. Inside, behind closed doors in executive suites overlooking the city, men in expensive suits are making calculations. Not moral calculations, financial ones. The question isn't whether to do business with Nazi Germany. The question is how much profit can be extracted from the coming storm. The Chase National Bank wasn't born in darkness. Its origins trace back to 1877, when John Thompson founded the Chase National Bank, naming it after Salmon P. Chase, Abraham Lincoln's Treasury Secretary and a champion of national currency. Ironic, isn't it? A bank named after a man who helped preserve the Union would later help finance those who sought to destroy everything the Union stood for. By the early 20th century, Chase had become one of America's financial titans, surviving the panic of 1907, expanding aggressively through the Roaring '20s, absorbing smaller banks like a corporate leviathan. When the Great Depression hit, Chase didn't just survive, it thrived, consolidating power while competitors collapsed. The man who transformed Chase into a global powerhouse was Winthrop Aldrich, who became chairman in 1934. Aldrich was everything you'd expect from American aristocracy: Yale-educated, impeccably dressed, connected to the Rockefeller family through marriage. He spoke the language of international finance fluently, viewing the world not as nations but as markets, not as people but as opportunities for capital expansion. Under his leadership, Chase opened branches across Europe, including a critical office in Paris that would become the nerve center of its European operations. The bank's philosophy was simple: money has no nationality, no allegiance, no conscience. Profit transcends politics. But there was another player in this story, someone whose name would become synonymous with the darkest chapter of Chase's history: Carl J. Schmidt. Schmidt ran Chase's Paris branch, and he was a true believer, not in American democracy, but in efficiency, order, and the kind of authoritarian clarity that fascism promised. When you read his internal memos, preserved in archives that the bank would rather remain sealed, you see a man who didn't just tolerate doing business with Nazis, he admired them. He saw Hitler's regime as a stabilizing force, a bulwark against communism, a government that understood the importance of protecting capital and private property. Now, let's be clear about something before we go deeper. This isn't a story about a few rogue employees making bad decisions. This is serious, institutional complicity. This is corporate strategy. Because while Schmidt was the face of Chase's Nazi collaboration, he wasn't acting alone or against company policy. He was executing it. The economic landscape of the 1930s was treacherous. Germany, crushed by the Treaty of Versailles, was drowning in debt and hyperinflation. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he promised economic revival, and he delivered, through massive rearmament, public works projects, and the systematic looting of Jewish assets. International banks watched this transformation with interest. Here was a nation rebuilding itself, creating demand for capital, for credit, for the kind of financial services that institutions like Chase specialized in providing. The fact that this economic miracle was built on persecution, on the theft of Jewish property, on preparation for war, well, that was politics. And banks, as they love to remind everyone, don't do politics, they do business. Chase's involvement with Nazi Germany began before the war, but it accelerated dramatically after 1940. When Germany invaded France in May of that year, most American banks evacuated their European operations. Chase did something different. Schmidt stayed. The Paris branch remained open, now operating under Nazi occupation, and it didn't just survive, it flourished. Here's where the story becomes truly disturbing, where numbers on ledgers translate into human tragedy. The Chase Paris branch began managing accounts for German businesses operating in occupied France. It processed transactions for companies that were seizing Jewish property, that were using slave labor, that were integral to the Nazi war machine. Schmidt personally signed off on freezing the accounts of Jewish customers, effectively confiscating their assets and handing them over to the occupiers.
Let that sink in! An American bank operating under American corporate authority was actively participating in the economic persecution of Jews. Not passively, actively. But it gets worse. Chase facilitated the sale of Nazi bonds to American investors. These weren't just any bonds. They were securities issued by the German government to finance its military expansion. The bank earned commissions on every sale, profiting directly from Hitler's preparation for war. Internal documents show that Chase executives were fully aware of what these funds would be used for. They knew, and they proceeded anyway because the profit margins were too attractive to resist. If this corporate greed disturbs you, hit like to support our dives into historical archives and comment what you would do in such a dilemma. Would you have the courage to say no when everyone around you was saying yes? When your career, your reputation,
your financial future depended on going along? The mechanics of Chase's collaboration were sophisticated. The bank used its international network to move money across borders, circumventing restrictions and sanctions. It maintained correspondent relationships with German banks, including Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank, both of which were deeply involved in financing the Holocaust. Through these relationships, Chase helped German companies access American markets, convert currencies, and move assets. Every transaction generated fees. Every service provided generated profit. The blood was invisible, but it was there in every dollar that changed hands. One of the most damning pieces of evidence comes from a 1941 memo written by Schmidt to Chase headquarters in New York. In it, he describes his efforts to maintain good relations with German authorities, noting that cooperation with the occupation government was essential for the bank's continued operations and profitability. He doesn't express concern about the moral implications. He doesn't question whether an American institution should be collaborating with a regime at war with American allies. He simply reports on business conditions, as if managing accounts for Nazis was no different than managing accounts for any other client.
The human cost of these transactions is incalculable. Consider this. When Chase froze Jewish accounts, those families lost access to the resources they needed to escape. Money that could have bought passage to safety, that could have bribed officials, that could have meant the difference between life and death, was locked away, inaccessible, eventually confiscated. How many people died because they couldn't access their own money? How many families were separated? How many children were sent to camps because a bank decided that profit mattered more than people? On War Profits, we tell the real story without filters. Where are you watching from? Share this with someone who needs to know these secrets, because this history isn't taught in business schools. It's buried in archives, hidden behind corporate PR, obscured by decades of rebranding and reputation management. Let's talk about the scale. Chase wasn't a minor player in occupied France. By 1942, it was one of the largest foreign banks operating under Nazi control. It employed hundreds of people, managed millions of dollars in assets, and processed thousands of transactions monthly. Every employee who showed up to work, every manager who signed off on accounts, every executive who reviewed the Paris branch's financial reports, they were all part of the machine. Some knew exactly what they were doing. Others convinced themselves they were just doing their jobs, following orders, maintaining neutrality in a complex situation. But neutrality in the face of evil is complicity. Silence in the face of injustice is consent. The bank's defenders, and there were many, both during the war and after, argued that Chase was simply protecting its assets, that abandoning the Paris branch would have meant losing everything, that Schmidt was trying to preserve the bank's European operations for the post-war period. These arguments ignore a fundamental truth. Some things are worth losing. Some prices are too high to pay. When the cost of doing business is collaboration with genocide, the only moral choice is to walk away. But Chase didn't walk away. It doubled down. In 1943, as the Holocaust reached its industrial peak, as trains carried millions to death camps, as the gas chambers of Auschwitz operated around the clock, Chase was still processing transactions for German companies. The bank was still earning fees, still generating profits, still sending positive financial reports back to New York. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position is staggering. How do you reconcile the image of yourself as a respectable banker, a pillar of the community, a family man, with the reality that your work is helping to finance mass murder? The answer, for many of these men, was compartmentalization. They separated the financial from the moral, the professional from the personal. They told themselves that they weren't responsible for what their clients did with the money, that they were just intermediaries, that if they didn't provide these services, someone else would. These are the same rationalizations that have justified atrocities throughout history. They're the same excuses we hear today when corporations profit over people, when financial institutions enable corruption, when banks launder money for dictators and criminals. Now, here's a twist that makes this story even more complex. Chase wasn't alone. Other American companies were doing business with Nazi Germany, both before and during the war. IBM provided the punch card technology that helped the Nazis track and catalog victims. Ford and General Motors had factories in Germany producing military vehicles. Standard Oil sold fuel to the German military. This was a systemic problem, a failure not just of individual corporations, but of the entire capitalist system, which proved unable or unwilling to subordinate profit to principle. But Chase's case is particularly egregious because of the nature of banking. A bank isn't just another business. It's the circulatory system of the economy. Money flows through banks the way blood flows through veins. And banks decide where that money goes, who gets access to capital, who prospers, and who fails. When Chase chose to facilitate Nazi transactions, it was making a choice about whose economic activity to enable, whose ambitions to finance, whose vision of the future to support. And it chose Hitler. The war ended in 1945. The Reich collapsed. The death camps were liberated. The world saw the full horror of what had been done. And Chase? Chase survived. Schmidt was recalled to New York, but he wasn't fired. He wasn't prosecuted. He retired quietly, with his pension intact. The Paris branch was cleaned up, reopened under new management, and resumed normal operations. The bank issued no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no reckoning with its wartime activities. In the immediate post-war period, there were investigations. The U.S. government looked into American companies that had collaborated with the Nazis. Some executives were questioned. Documents were reviewed. But the investigations were half-hearted, the conclusions ambiguous. The Cold War was beginning, and America needed strong corporations to compete with the Soviet Union. Prosecuting major banks for wartime collaboration wasn't a priority. It was easier to move on, to focus on rebuilding, to let the past remain buried. This is where the story becomes a study in institutional amnesia. Chase merged with the Manhattan Company in 1955 to become Chase Manhattan Bank. Later, it merged with J.P. Morgan to become J.P. Morgan Chase, now one of the largest financial institutions in the world. Each merger was an opportunity to rebrand, to create distance from the past, to bury the uncomfortable history under layers of new corporate identity. Today, if you walk into a Chase branch, if you use a Chase credit card, if you bank with J.P. Morgan Chase, you're dealing with the direct descendant of the institution that helped finance the Third Reich. The name has changed, the logo has evolved, but the institution remains. It wasn't until the late 1990s that Chase's wartime activities received serious scrutiny. Holocaust survivors and their descendants filed lawsuits against Swiss banks for hoarding Nazi gold and Jewish assets. The publicity from those cases prompted investigations into other banks, including American ones. Researchers began digging through archives, uncovering documents that Chase had, angry, hoped would remain hidden forever. The evidence was damning. Memos, transaction records, correspondence between Schmidt and New York headquarters, all painting a picture of deliberate, systematic collaboration. In 1999, Chase Manhattan Bank acknowledged its wartime activities in occupied France. Note the language, acknowledged, not apologized for. The bank released a statement expressing regret for the actions of its Paris branch, but it stopped short of accepting full responsibility. It argued that Schmidt had acted with some degree of autonomy, that communication with New York was limited during the war, that the bank's leadership hadn't fully understood what was happening in Paris. These claims are contradicted by the documentary evidence, which shows regular communication and clear awareness at the highest levels of the bank. Chase also participated in a settlement fund established to compensate Holocaust survivors whose assets had been seized by banks during the war. The bank contributed millions of dollars, a sum that sounds substantial until you compare it to the bank's annual profits, which run into the tens of billions. It was, in essence, a rounding error, a cost of doing business, a small price to pay to make the problem go away. But the problem doesn't go away. It can't, because it raises questions that remain relevant today. How do we hold corporations accountable for historical crimes? What does justice look like when the perpetrators are long dead and the institution has transformed beyond recognition? How do we balance the need for economic stability with the demand for moral accountability? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're urgent practical concerns in a world where corporations wield enormous power, where financial institutions shape the global economy, where the decisions made in boardrooms affect millions of lives. The Chase story also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American complicity in the Holocaust. We like to tell ourselves that America was the hero of World War II, that we liberated Europe, that we stood against fascism. And in many ways, that's true. American soldiers fought and died to defeat the Nazis. American industry produced the weapons and supplies that made victory possible. But American corporations also profited from the Nazi regime. American banks facilitated Nazi transactions. American companies employed slave labor in German factories. The history is more complicated, more morally ambiguous than the heroic narrative we prefer. This complexity doesn't excuse Chase's actions. If anything, it makes them more damning, because the bank had a choice. Unlike German companies operating under direct Nazi control, Chase was an American institution, protected by American law, answerable to American regulators. It could have closed its Paris branch. It could have refused to do business with the occupation government. It would have taken courage. It would have cost money, but it was possible. The bank chose profit over principle, and that choice had consequences measured in human lives. Let me share a story that puts a human face on these abstract financial crimes. In 1941, a Jewish family in Paris, let's call them the Bernsteins, though that's not their real name, tried to access their account at Chase to buy exit visas and passage to America. They had been customers for years, had saved diligently, had trusted the bank with their life savings. When they arrived at the branch, they were told their account was frozen by order of the German authorities. The bank manager, a Frenchman working under Schmidt's supervision, expressed sympathy but said there was nothing he could do. The Bernsteins were deported to Auschwitz 3 months later. None of them survived. Their money remained in the frozen account, eventually absorbed into the bank's general funds. This story, documented in testimony given to post-war investigators, is just one of thousands. Each frozen account represents a family, a life, a future stolen. If this makes you angry, if this makes you question how such things could happen, comment below about what you think corporations owe to history, to memory, to the victims of their past crimes. And subscribe to War Prophets, because we're committed to uncovering these stories, to making sure they're not forgotten, to asking the hard questions that others would rather avoid. The legal and ethical frameworks we use to judge corporate behavior evolved partly in response to cases like Chase's. The Nuremberg trials established that individuals and organizations could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, that just following orders wasn't a valid defense. Later, international law extended these principles to corporations, recognizing that businesses can be complicit in human rights abuses, that they have responsibilities beyond maximizing shareholder value. But enforcement remains weak, accountability remains elusive, and corporations continue to prioritize profit over people in conflict zones around the world. Chase's transformation from Nazi collaborator to global financial giant is a case study in corporate resilience and moral flexibility. The bank didn't just survive its wartime activities, it thrived. It expanded aggressively in the post-war period, opening branches across Europe, Asia, and Latin America.
It pioneered new financial instruments, embraced technological innovation, and positioned itself at the center of global capitalism. By the time the truth about its wartime activities emerged, Chase was too big, too important, too interconnected with the global economy to seriously punish. The bank had become, in the language of the 2008 financial crisis, too big to fail, and apparently too big to be held fully accountable. This raises a disturbing question. What's to stop it from happening again? What prevents banks from collaborating with authoritarian regimes today? The answer is not much. Banks currently do business with governments that commit human rights abuses, that suppress dissent, that wage wars of aggression. They facilitate transactions for oligarchs and dictators. They help corrupt officials hide stolen assets. The mechanisms are more sophisticated, the paper trails more carefully obscured, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Profit trumps principle, and moral considerations are externalized as someone else's problem. The Chase case also illuminates the broader relationship between capitalism and fascism. We like to think of these as opposites, that free markets and totalitarianism are incompatible. But history tells a different story. Fascist regimes have often been friendly to big business, protecting private property, suppressing labor unions, and creating opportunities for profit. And businesses have often been willing to work with fascist governments, as long as the terms were favorable. The relationship between Chase and the Third Reich wasn't an aberration. It was a logical extension of capitalist principles taken to their amoral extreme. If it's legal and it's profitable, do it. But here's what haunts me about this story, what keeps me up at night thinking about it: the banality of it all. These weren't monsters. They were ordinary men in suits, going to work, doing their jobs, making rational decisions within a system that valued profit above all else. Schmidt probably went home to his family, had dinner, read to his children, saw himself as a good person doing difficult work in challenging times. The executives in New York probably attended church, donated to charity, considered themselves pillars of their communities. Evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in a memo, in a transaction record, in a decision made in a conference room by people who have convinced themselves that they're just doing business. This is the real lesson of the Chase story. How easily ordinary people, ordinary institutions can become complicit in extraordinary evil when they prioritize profit over principle, when they separate the financial from the moral, when they tell themselves that business is business and politics is politics. The line between legitimate commerce and collaboration with atrocity is thinner than we'd like to believe, and it's crossed not with dramatic gestures, but with small compromises, incremental decisions, rationalizations that seem reasonable at the time. Today, J.P. Morgan Chase is a global financial powerhouse, managing trillions of dollars in assets, employing hundreds of thousands of people, shaping the global economy. The bank has a corporate social responsibility program, a diversity initiative, a commitment to sustainable finance. It sponsors museums and orchestras. It funds scholarships and community development projects. And, buried deep in its history, rarely mentioned in official corporate communications, is the fact that it once helped finance the Third Reich. The bank would prefer you sarcastic, not think about that. It would prefer to focus on the present and future, not the past. But we can't afford to forget. We can't afford to let corporations bury their histories, to rebrand away from their crimes, to use mergers and name changes to create distance from accountability.
Because if we forget, if we allow institutional amnesia to take hold, then we guarantee that it will happen again. Different companies, different regimes, different victims, but the same fundamental dynamic of profit prioritized over human dignity. The war ended, but the disgust never stopped. The machines of death were dismantled, but the machines of capital kept running, kept growing, kept accumulating. The people who made decisions that facilitated genocide retired with their pensions intact, their reputations mostly unblemished, their consciences apparently clear. And the institution they served became more powerful, more influential, more central to the global economy than ever before. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we reconcile the fact that we live in a world where the descendants of Nazi collaborators are now pillars of the financial system? How do we hold institutions accountable for crimes committed generations ago? How do we ensure that the pursuit of profit doesn't again lead to complicity in atrocity? There are no easy answers, but asking the questions is essential. Remembering is essential. Refusing to let corporations hide behind mergers and rebrands is essential. Demanding that businesses acknowledge their full histories, including the darkest chapters, is essential. And recognizing that the systems that enabled Chase's collaboration with the Nazis, the prioritization of profit, the separation of business from ethics, the belief that money has no moral dimension, those systems are still with us, still shaping decisions, still creating opportunities for ordinary people to become complicit in extraordinary evil. This is why we do what we do on War Profits. Not to shame or punish, but to remember and learn. Not to condemn the present for the sins of the past, but to understand how those sins were possible, how ordinary institutions became instruments of horror, how the pursuit of profit can lead to places darker than we can imagine. If you believe this history matters, if you think these stories need to be told, subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Start conversations. Ask uncomfortable questions. Because the only way to prevent history from repeating is to remember it fully, honestly, without flinching from the darkest truths. The trail of money leads to places we'd rather not look. It runs through marble halls and executive suites, through transaction records and account ledgers, through decisions made in conference rooms by men who convinced themselves they were just doing business. It leads to frozen accounts and seized assets, to families trapped and desperate, to trains heading east, to camps where the machinery of death ran on schedules as precise as any bank's. And it leads here, to now, to us, to the question of what we do with this knowledge, how we hold the past accountable, how we ensure that the pursuit of profit never again becomes complicit in the machinery of genocide. Chase Bank helped finance the Third Reich. That's not speculation or exaggeration. It's documented historical fact. And the institution that did this still exists, transformed and renamed, but fundamentally continuous with its past. When you see that blue octagon logo, when you use that credit card, when you bank with JP Morgan Chase, you're dealing with the direct descendant of an institution that chose profit over principle at humanity's darkest hour. The question isn't whether to judge them. History has already rendered its verdict. The question is what we do now, how we ensure that corporations can never again hide behind the claim that business is business, that money has no nationality, that profit transcends morality. Because it doesn't. Money is a human creation, and like all human creations, it carries moral weight. Every transaction has consequences. Every decision shapes the world. And when we forget that, when we allow institutions to separate the financial from the ethical, we create the conditions for atrocity. Remember this story, share it, let it disturb you. Let it make you question the systems we've built, the institutions we trust. The belief that capitalism is somehow neutral or amoral, it's not. It never was. And the sooner we recognize that every economic decision is also a moral decision, the sooner we can build systems that prioritize human dignity over profit, that value life over ledgers, that refuse to do business with those who would destroy everything we claim to hold dear. The war ended, the Reich fell, but the banks remained. And the question of how much morality costs, how much principle is worth, how we balance profit against human life, that question remains unanswered, urgent, demanding our attention.
This is the legacy of Chase Bank's collaboration with Nazi Germany. Not just the historical crime, but the ongoing challenge of how we hold power accountable, how we ensure that never again means never again, how we build an economy that serves humanity rather than consuming it. This is War Profits. This is the story they don't want told. This is the truth buried in archives, hidden behind corporate PR, obscured by decades of rebranding. But it's our truth, our history, our responsibility to remember and learn from. Because if we forget, if we allow the past to be sanitized and buried, then we guarantee that somewhere, sometime, when the next crisis comes, when the next regime offers profit in exchange for complicity, there will be institutions ready to make that deal, and the trail of money will once again lead to places too dark to imagine. Don't let them forget. Don't let them hide. Remember, question.
Demand accountability. Because the price of silence is measured in human lives, and that's a cost too high for any society to bear.